Assessing mental capacity. What is mental capacity? It is simply put an individual's ability to make a decision. And what is an act? A written law passed by Parliament. So why was the Mental Capacity Act created? Initially, in the early 90s, there were concerns throughout Europe that vulnerable people were not having say in decisions about their own lives. Also, there were cases that came to court where it was found that there was no legal framework to support clinicians in treating patients who lack capacity in their best interests. The Mental Capacity Act was put together from best practice principles. What is the Mental Capacity Act trying to encourage? Patient-centred thinking and care, open communication about all aspects of care, including risks, avoiding discrimination, and a clear legal framework. There are 5 key principles to the Mental Capacity Act. The first is that a person must be assumed to have capacity unless it is established that they lack capacity. Number 2 is a person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision unless all practicable steps to help them do so have been taken without success. Number 3 is that a person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision merely because they make an unwise decision. Number 4, an act done or decision made under this act or for or on behalf of a person who lacks capacity must be done or made in their best interests. And number 5, before the act is done or decision is made, regard must be had to whether the purpose for which it is needed can be as effectively achieved in a way that is less restrictive of the person's rights and freedom of action. If we follow these 5 key principles, then we are doing a pretty good job in the eyes of the Mental Capacity Act. So, we need to complete an assessment of a patient's mental capacity when the patient needs to make a decision and you have reasonable belief they may not be able to make that decision for themselves. So, what sorts of decisions do patients need to make whilst they're in hospital? Do I agree to stay here for care and treatment? Do I agree to have an operation? Do I agree to discharge home? Do I agree to go to a rehabilitation unit? Why do we want to understand if a patient can make decisions or not? One of the most important things we want to get from our patients at any time throughout their stay is informed consent. We also need to ensure that there's a legal framework in a situation where someone cannot give their informed consent, that we can safely make decisions on their behalf. So, is there a decision that the patient needs to make, and what is it? Do you have reasonable belief that the patient would not be able to make this decision? So what are your grounds for the assessment? Is there a chance that this patient may be able to make this decision for themselves in the future? Can the decision wait? Is there anything you could do in order to support the patient to make the decision on their own? And have you done this? Then, and only then, once all of these questions have been answered, you can complete a mental capacity assessment, which comes in 2 stages. Ensure you're informed about the decision that needs to be made. How can you assess how informed the patient is if you don't understand the decision or the risks yourself? So before going in and assessing capacity, make sure that you fully understand the decision yourself. Make sure you go and talk to the patient. That might seem fairly self-explanatory, but we just need to make sure that these capacity assessments have been done with the patient, not off opinions from other people, not off opinions from family members, that you've gone and spoken directly with the patient to understand how much they understand of the decision they're trying to make. So, Mental capacity assessment comes in 2 stages. Stage 1, the functional assessment. This is where there are 4 questions. Can the person understand all the information relevant to the decision? Retain that information for long enough to make the decision? Weigh up or use that information in making the decision, so that's weighing up the risks? And can they communicate their decision? So to break that down, understand. Do they understand the nature of the decision? Do they understand the reason why the decision is needed? Do they understand the likely effects of deciding one way or another, or making no decision at all? Retain. Can the person retain the information relevant to the decision for long enough to make the decision? They do not need to retain that information until next week. They actually don't need to retain that information necessarily till the end of the day. They just need to be able to retain it for long enough to be able to weigh up the risks and make the decision. Weigh up. Can the patient weigh up the risks of the decision? And finally, communicate. Can the patient communicate their decision to you in any way? Communication does not need to be verbal. It's very rare that we have a no for this question. The only time we'd expect to see that is if the patient was unconscious or in some very limited circumstances where maybe someone has locked-in syndrome and they have no way of communicating at all. So the second stage of the assessment of capacity is the diagnostic test. Is the inability to make a decision caused by an impairment of or disturbance in the functioning of a person's mind or brain? This is where we would put, if there is a diagnosis, so dementia, learning disability, brain injury, or if it's a short-term confusion, perhaps delirium, intoxication could be an impairment of or disturbance in the functioning of the person's mind or brain, or we can put something as simple as confusion. When patients first come into the hospital, we don't always know exactly what the impairment is, but we can often tell that the reason for their inability to make the decision is an internal factor, not an external factor. They're not being manipulated into not being able to make a decision, but that actually it's because they're having trouble making that decision for themselves. Document. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. If we've not documented a capacity assessment, then we need to return to the first principle that we presume the patient has capacity and we provide all care and treatment in line with their wishes. So what do we do if a patient is deemed to have mental capacity? If the patient has capacity to consent to the decision, then decisions need to be in line with the patient's wishes. This doesn't mean that we don't discuss the decision with the patient. We always want to ensure that the patient has all the information, and patients do change their minds, and that's okay. So what if a patient is deemed to lack mental capacity? If the patient lacks capacity to consent to the decision, there's a few considerations to be made. Does the patient have lasting power of attorney for health and welfare? Does the patient have a court-appointed deputy? And does the patient have any advanced decisions in place? So a lasting power of attorney is when the patient, when they had capacity, chose a friend or family member to make decisions for them in a situation where in the future they may lack capacity. A court-appointed deputy is when the courts have appointed somebody to make decisions on behalf of the patient. And an advanced decision is a document that can be put together through the Mental Capacity Act, which allows the patients to refuse certain treatment if in the future they lack capacity to make that decision for themselves. They can refuse things for themselves in the future. If the patient has any of these, we need to firstly see evidence of that, and that evidence needs to be scanned into their EPIC notes. and then we need to refer to the person who is relevant, so the lasting power of attorney or the court-appointed deputy. So, best interest decisions. If the patient lacks capacity to consent to the decision and there is no legal authority, so there's no lasting power of attorney, there's no court-appointed deputy, and there's no advance decision, a best interest decision would need to be made. Best interest decision is not merely what you believe is in the patient's best interests. If the patient had the mental capacity to decide, what would they want? There is steps in the Mental Capacity Act to help you work out what is in a patient's best interests. So 1, do not discriminate. 2, consider all relevant circumstances. 3, consider if it's likely the person will regain the capacity. 4, encourage participation from the person. 5, not be motivated by a desire to bring about the person's death. 6, consider the person's past and present views, wishes, values and beliefs. And 7, consult relevant people. What if there's no one else to consult? It is particularly difficult to make a best interest decision without a friend or family member who can represent the patient's views or wishes. In these situations, we can refer for an independent mental capacity advocate or an IMCA who can advocate on the patient's behalf. Best interest meeting. On some occasions, it is necessary to have a meeting to establish differing opinions in relation to the decision that needs to be made. This can include anyone who is relevant to the decision. If required, an IMCA would likely be asked to attend the best interest meeting as well. Who is the decision maker? Generally, the decision maker is the person who proposed the treatment or plan. It is often, but not always, the person who completed the mental capacity assessment. And the decision maker's job is to take into account all of the views and make the final best interest decision. So if the decision was to have a surgery, then we'd expect the surgeon to be the decision maker. If the decision was whether a patient was to have a catheter fitted, then a nurse might be more suitable to be the decision maker in that situation. Key messages. Assessments of mental capacity need to be completed when a patient has a decision to make, but you have reasonable belief they will not be able to make it. Someone is deemed to lack capacity if they are unable to communicate, understand, retain, or balance information, and they have an impairment or disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain. If a patient has capacity, we need to ensure we provide care and treatment in line with their wishes. If a patient lacks capacity, we need to ensure any decisions made on their behalf are in their best interests. Thank you for listening. If you are ever stuck, please call and ask for support from our adult safeguarding team. Our contact details are on Connect.